that we could pass this around like this or assign it to something else because it's basically a variable, right? Just like anything else. The value here just happens to be a function, not a number or a string or something. In fact, what if we did this? Function, whatever. Don't give it a name. An anonymous function. And then we say const say yeah equals that function. Just so we can make sure we're dealing with the right thing. We'll make it, oh yeah. Does that work? Oh yeah, it does. Uh-huh. That's right. That's fine. We could just save the function to a variable. Perfectly fine. What about, okay, if we can do this anonymous function thing, could we just, so click, I could just put the string literal right in here, or I could probably say const event equals click and put the variable name in here, right? That probably works. Or I could just put the value straight in there. So what if, instead of the variable name say yeah, if I just put the function, the bare function right in there like that? Think I can do it? Yeah. Yep. Totally. Totally can. We might do that quite a bit sooner or later. For right now, it just clutters things up. If you're never going to use this function again for anything else, it might be worth it, and if there's no explanation necessary. Like for right now, the name of the function actually tells us what it does, right? So that's nice. It's sort of self-documenting. When you click it, what? Run some anonymous function. When you click it, say yeah. Okay, now I understand exactly what this is supposed to do. So sort of self-documenting in that way, which is nice. But this doesn't actually do anything very interesting. It just says yeah. And in fact, it uses an alert, which is super annoying. So let's see if we can do something a little more interesting. Everybody install, or everybody have some terminal. Mac users, you have it built in. Linux users, you have it built in. Everybody else, did you install Git Bash and or Hyper? Go ahead and fire that rascal up. And when you launch it, it'll probably put you in your home directory. You can always tell what directory you're in by typing pwd for print working directory. I'm in /user/dstruce. You're probably in your user directory, whatever that is, /user/whatever. Cool. So we're going to have a number of projects in this boot camp. So we're going to make a separate folder for all of them. So we're going to mookdir. That is, make a directory. And you can call it something like XTBC or Extreme Bootcamp, whatever you want. So that command mooks the dir, but we're not yet in the dir, are we? We're still in our home directory. It doesn't change you into it automatically. So I need to change directories to the one I just created with cd space name of directory. And I'm just going to type xt and hit tab to make sure I don't mistype it. Yeah, okay, cool. Tab completion. It's your friend. Cool. So now we're getting ready to create a project. So let's mookdir to hold that project in. mkdir. Let's call it person stats. Not a great name. So now I've mooked the dir, but I'm not yet in the dir. Still got a cd, p tab, person stats. Now I know I typed the right thing. If I want to be extra darn sure that I'm in the right place, I can type pwd c. Yes, indeed, I am inside person stats. Because before long, we're going to start running commands that we don't want to run in the wrong place. So I want to write some code in here. So assuming you've installed Visual Studio Code, just type code space dot. Dot always represents the current directory, whatever the current directory happens to be. And if you open up Visual Studio Code at that directory, then it won't show you anything else, and any new files you create will be in the directory for that project, which is nice. Lovely little welcome page here, but we're going to make our own page. So over here under person stats, this little icon here will create a new file. Let's create a new file, and let's call it index.html. Why index? Well, if you are using a web server where all it does inside the question mark is load files from the file system and send it back in the response, if you request just a directory or a folder name without specifying a file, it'll look for an index.html, and if it finds it, it'll send it back. So it's a good default page name. Index.html. Now, you may or may not have noticed that on the website for the class, after the setup instructions is this section on tools, which includes some extensions and key bindings for Visual Studio Code. I do recommend these, so if you didn't install them, you might want to install them tonight. It's not too hard to do, but some of these are going to be a big help. Right now, I'm going to use this one, HTML Boilerplate. And what that does for me is add a snippet so I don't have to type the basic empty HTML document structure. I just type HTML tab, voila. And now I have an HTML document. Now I'm going to get rid of these conditional comments because they're not really doing us any good. You can leave them if you want. That's for old versions of IE. But we'll just simplify a tad. And notice the HTML element is the root element. Everything else is inside there. There's a head with some metadata, and there's a body, and that's where everything we really want goes. But up in the head, there is this title, and it's empty, no contents right now. So let's go ahead and just put person stats in there. And just so that something shows up on the page, inside our body, let's make an H1. Top level heading. Nice and big. Person stats. If you don't have HTML5 boilerplate installed, I am going to copy and paste this into Slack real quick. There you go. And now we have something to start from. It'd be nice to open this in our browser. We have a few ways we could do this. If Chrome is your default browser, then in the terminal, you can just open it from there, since you're in the right directory. On a Mac, that would be open index.html. On Windows, anytime I say open, you say start. So start index.html will open it in your default browser. If that's not Chrome, you might want to make it Chrome at least for the next 3 weeks, because seriously, we're going to use those developer tools a whole lot. And that should open up the browser and open it to the right page.
So what is it you put in there again? Start for Windows?
I didn't mean code anyway. I meant open. Yeah, start for Windows, yeah. Start index.html or open index.html on Mac. If you did install some of these extensions, one of them is called View in Browser. And so right from code here, you could type Command F1 or Control F1. Does the same thing. One way or another, we want to open up index.html in the browser so we can see our H1 and observe that the title is there as well. Beautiful. Not much to it yet, but that's okay. So right now it works. It doesn't do much, but it works. This is a good first step. So I say it's time for version control. Who's used Git before? Who has used, keep your hands up, who has used some other version control system like Subversion or Team Foundation Server or something like that? Okay. So who has, hands down, who has not used version control at all? Okay. So we will talk more about it tomorrow. But basically, we can store the entire history, every single version of our app, as long as we keep saving things to our history along the way. And that's what we're going to do, so we can always get back to a working state should we break everything. And also, it's easier to retrace our steps if we can see step by step how we did this. So we're going to make this our first snapshot in history, so to speak. So make darn sure you're in the right directory and type git space init to initialize an empty Git repository. It said it created the empty Git repository in a .git subfolder. So on Unix machines, including Macs and Linux, preceding a file name with a dot makes it hidden. Doesn't do that on Windows, so it probably won't be hidden. But we could still look at it if we really wanted to. You don't necessarily need to do this, but I'm going to do it just to show it to you. So I will go ahead and open that directory. If you do want to do this on Windows, again, that would be start instead of open. Open.git. Here we go. All right. I have a file called config, a file called description, a file called head, and I've got 4 directories. I thought I initialized an empty Git repository. Well, an empty Git repository still has some stuff in it. But we never need to know that. This all happens behind the scenes. Git manages it for us. We never even need to worry about it. But just so you know, it's not magic. There is something there. We can pretend that directory just isn't there. Git is taking care of it for us. So it is indeed an empty Git repository. There's nothing in it. So let's put something in it. To do that, first we need to tell it about the files that we want it to know about. Because right now, if we type git status, which we can type at any time just to get a general idea of what's going on with Git, it'll say initial commit, untracked files in it lists index.html in red. Nothing added to commit, but untracked files present. Use Git Add to track. Let's use Git Add. So what we're doing, if we type Git Add index.html, now that's a file that Git is paying attention to. There is now a reference to that somewhere in that hidden folder. But we couldn't get back to this version of it because we haven't labeled it, really. We haven't labeled that point in history. If we type git status now, we see changes to be committed, new file index.html, and it's now in green. So if we were to commit, that would make it in there. So let's do that. Git commit -m for message. And this is how we actually add something to history permanently and label it. And we want to type a message saying what we did at this step. In this case, it's our very first commit, so we'll just say initial commit in double quotes, git commit -m, initial commit. Perfectly fine, and you should see something like that. Create mode blah blah blah. All right, great. Now it's there on our local machine. And yeah, the entire repository lives on your machine. You don't need a server to use Git. You can just do all the version control locally. Now, you might want to sync it with some other machine, either because you've got more developers on your team or because you don't want to lose everything if something happens to your laptop. So you can add a remote to your repository, which is just another machine that also has Git installed that's going to store another copy of this. And then we can synchronize the two. So that's what we need to do next. And the remote we're going to add is GitHub, because that's what it's there for. So go out to your GitHub account. And in the upper right, you'll see a little plus. So create a new repository. Go ahead and name it something like person stats. There's no particular reason that it has to match the name of the folder where you created the project, but for your own sanity, name it the same thing. Otherwise, it might get very confusing. You can make it public or private or whatever. You can initialize it with a README, but don't. Don't check any of those things for now. Just leave the defaults. You don't need to add these two files. Just create the repository because we already have a repository locally. So you don't want to initialize it with anything in it. Go ahead and hit Create Repository. And then you might see what is an overwhelming amount of information. But if you read carefully, quick setup if you've done this kind of thing before. We haven't, so never mind that. Or create a new repository on the command line. Already did it, don't need to do that. Or push an existing repository from the command line. That sounds like us. So there's two commands here. The first, Git Remote Add. So that's what we said we needed to do, right? We already have a repository, and we need to tell it about a remote that we want to sync with. So we run Git Remote Add. And then we name the remote. You could name it anything, but typically you name it origin, if it's kind of the source. And then the URL of the repository. And then you run this, git push, which takes your local history and pushes it up to the remote, in this case, GitHub. This tells it some stuff that you just have to tell it the very first time you push. It tells it what specifically to track on the remote, and we don't understand what that means just yet, so don't worry about it. Just run that once, and from then on, we can just write git push. So if you go ahead and copy these two, and notice there is a nice little copy to clipboard thing over here. Keeps you from making typos. Paste it in, and it'll go ahead and run the first command, but it won't run the second command until you hit enter. But go ahead and do that. So if you didn't quite follow all the instructions during setup, you might get some problems from Git about not knowing who you are, that you need to set the username and email. If that's the case, just follow the instructions that it says there and run those two commands. It'll be like git config -- global something. Anybody get that? No? So what does happen? You have a problem? Or, yeah, what's up?
Mine says, well, it looks like it did the remote add.
Mm-hmm.
But then for the push, it says origin does not appear to be your Git repository and could not read from remote repository.
Okay, so it seems like maybe the URL at the end of that line isn't quite right or something. That's interesting. If it works, then if you refresh this page with the instructions on it, if you refresh it, you should see your actual repository now. So in this case, so I see my index.html, and I see one commit. If I click there where it says one commit, I see initial commit, committed 2 minutes ago. Yay. It worked.